Yeah, hey everyone, I'm not Grace Braithwaite, but I am, I'm another Grace, and I'm also part of CBH here in Cambridge. And yeah, I just wanted to give kind of like a rough introduction to biosecurity, specifically looking at like where the next disease X could come from. And then yeah, I also just have a bit of an overview of like my journey and how I got to be working with CBH. So I did my undergrad at the University of Exeter, and the pandemic actually hit at the end of my first year. So I found that very quickly everything I was doing at university, but also everything I was doing in my whole life, was now to do with biosecurity in some way, shape or form. So I think that's like what really kicked me off on the journey. And so then I started my PhD at Cambridge. I've just started my third year and I study infectious diseases. So particularly interested in the molecular determinants of spillover from coronaviruses from different animals, especially rodents and bats, into humans. And kind of while I was doing this research, I was learning more about the huge impact that human activity is having on kind of new spillovers and outbreaks of new diseases. And then at the same time, I've also been training to work at BSL-3, so in the high containment lab with live replication competent coronaviruses. And so kind of both of these join together. So like my experience of reading about pandemic preparedness and biosecurity in that aspect, and then actually learning more about lab safety and kind of more risky class research kind of join together to be what I feel to be biosecurity. And so I joined CBH a year ago. I did a Fundamentals in Biosecurity Fellowship, and then I've been a member ever since. So just as an introduction to kind of the problem of biosecurity, how I see it. So to start with, I wanted to show you this timeline of different pandemics and major disease outbreaks throughout history. And so what's really interesting is, and also a bit alarming, is that since the year 2000, there's been 5 major disease outbreaks, whereas in the whole of the 20th century, there were only 4 major outbreaks. So we can immediately see that outbreaks of disease are becoming more common, and this is having a huge strain on healthcare and economic systems across the world. And the reason for this number of outbreaks is probably increasing because of increased things like globalization, population growth, and then also climate change as well. So I just wanted to illustrate this with a really simplified overview of kind of like the environment that we're in at the moment in the world that makes pandemics more likely to emerge. If we start off by imagining there's an area that has previously been wild or untouched, maybe there are small human settlements, but it's kind of overall quite isolated and wild. So if we start with increasing population of humans in an area, when they increase, they need 2 things. So they need more houses and they need more food. So to make more food, you need more agriculture. And when you build more houses and make more farms, this results in a big change in the land use of an area. And so that means that land that was previously wild is now being disrupted. So the wildlife is getting disrupted. And when the wildlife is disrupted, this makes them stressed. And so this might mean that their habits will change. So they might need to travel to different areas to find food or like new places to live. Or they might decide to come closer to humans and live in urban areas. So for example, bats roosting in like roofs and bridges, or rodents kind of intermingling closer with humans. And it might affect things like migration patterns, as well as stress itself just having a physiological effect on the wildlife. So that might make them more likely to be able to shed their viral load and pass on diseases. And so going back to the change of land use, when it's changing, you get increased urbanization, and you might end up with more livestock and maybe some intensive farming. So that means that we have more humans in closer proximity to livestock as well. Sorry, I just have to look at my diagram. And so this can kind of lead to humans and livestock being in more close proximity to wildlife. And this is the key kind of spark point where we might get spillovers. So either from wildlife directly into humans, or between wildlife and livestock, and then from livestock then it can spill over again into humans. And climate change is another really important aspect, and it kind of is a cause and consequence of a lot of the different things that I've illustrated here. So for example, things like changes to weather can have a really big effect. So if you imagine flooding or droughts, it can mean that the land use needs to be changed. So land that was once agricultural can't be used, so it needs to be relocated. Human settlements might need to be relocated, so again this is kind of disrupting wildlife. And then it can also cause loss of habitats and changes in migration patterns. So basically it's just, we're looking at like an overall disruption of the natural kind of granularity of different habitats, where humans are now moving into places that were where they previously weren't contacting different species, and this is kind of where we might be able to see viruses crossing over. And it's a really complicated process. This is obviously a partial and very simplified version of how diseases arise. So what kind of diseases are we talking about here? Well, at the moment there are already some viruses in circulation which are prioritised as major threats to global health. So the 8 viruses we have on this side are part of the World Health Organization watch list, and they all pose a risk of major outbreaks, or we might not have very good vaccines or effective treatments to stop them. But as well as these ones that we know about, we also want to be prepared for new outbreaks of unknown diseases. And so this has been classically termed as disease X. So this is a hypothetical unknown pathogen which could cause the next pandemic. But the key point here is that we don't know where it could come from. So how can we be prepared when we don't know what kind of virus it's going to be? Well, we can narrow down what kind we think it could be. So we've got around 25 families of viruses that are known to cause disease in humans. So there's a good chance that the next disease X could be from one of these families. So now I'm going to talk a bit more about the specific different scenarios where I think a disease X could come from, and I'll also highlight some of the families that I think are most likely to kind of birth these viruses. So firstly, and I think historically the most common scenario, is your classic spillover from wildlife. So this is where an animal virus makes a jump across the species barrier to infect humans. And these kind of species, generally, we're most interested in things like rodents, bats, and then wild birds as well. And so the kind of viruses that might be involved in this are likely to be RNA viruses, which are less stable and they're more prone to mutations. And then also viruses which are good at recombining, so swapping genetic information with each other, which helps them to adapt. And maybe they're also more flexible in terms of what receptors they can use. So as well as being able to use the receptor from their host species, they might also be able to use the receptors from other species, and that's kind of helping them in their journey. And then there might be intermediate species involved where, you know, it kind of jumps from one wild species to an intermediate, and then that enables the virus to adapt to become a little bit better at infecting humans, and then that's where the kind of second spillover into humans would occur. And so the viral families are probably the biggest suspects here are coronaviruses, since they're really good at recombining, they've got a really high rate of recombination, and they also have quite large animal reservoirs. So a lot of them circulate in bats and also in rodents, and obviously the geographical range of bat and rodent species is just vast. And so they're really likely to come into contact with humans, especially in kind of changing areas of changing land use. And then we also have things like paramyxoviruses, so viruses that are related to Nipah virus and Hendra, which again have quite a broad host range, as well as things like arenaviruses like Lissa fever, which is another one that was on the watch list, because they circulate in rodents. and then also orthomyxoviruses like avian influenza. And so the second scenario where we could get a new virus emerging is in more of an agricultural setting. So this is where we have livestock which are probably living in quite close quarters, that sort of become mixing vessels for circulating viruses, where they can kind of reassort with each other and adapt while they're bouncing around lots of organisms in close proximity. So this is a bit like the wildlife scenario, and it can also be linked. So it can be a spillover from wildlife into livestock, and then a bit of a mixing around in livestock, and then a consequent spillover to humans. And it's especially risky where we have intensive farming, and particularly farming of swine and poultry, or farms when where there are mixes of species living in quite close quarters, and that kind of makes the species jumps easier. And a particular culprit here are orthomyxoviruses, so like bird and swine flu. And this is what we're probably potentially seeing with in the US right now with H5N1 outbreak in dairy cattle. And then there are some other viruses as well, other families that are involved, like caliciviruses, which is like norovirus, and sapoviruses, so classic stomach bug. And then these viruses from this family have been found to circulate in pigs and humans, and some can kind of swap between both already. And then there are some other viral families that cause enteric diseases as well, like viruses from the astrovirus and rotavirus family, which are also known to circulate in different farmed animals. And so another source of new viruses is through human activity. So this has historically had a lower likelihood, but I think advances in technology at the moment mean that this is going to become a more serious risk. So especially with growing numbers of high containment labs across the world, as well as big advances in fields like biotechnology and synthetic biology, this kind of increases the risk of engineered pathogens being released into the environment. So this could be accidental because of things like poor governance of high containment work leading to accidental releases or contamination, but it could also be the result of deliberate state-sponsored bioweapons programs, or even the work of non-state actors like terrorists. And something that's really contributing towards the risks here is advancements in artificial intelligence. So that's making it a lot easier with like specific tools like AlphaFold, but also large language models. And that can kind of help non-specialists to design and grow engineered pathogens. So this one is pretty concerning, and it's got really serious potential consequences. But a lot of work is currently being done around kind of governing risky and gain-of-function research. And then things like the Bioweapons Convention have kind of been put in place to sort of ensure that things like state-sponsored bioweapons programs aren't really going on and like are being controlled more. So another interesting thing I wanted to touch on is the potential for new viruses coming from the Arctic. So when we think of the flowchart that I showed at the beginning, the Arctic is a really exceptional example of that. So it's historically been really isolated, and it's also especially vulnerable to climate change. So there could be things like ancient viruses that are frozen in the permafrost or in soil, and warming temperatures could lead them to be released. Also things like changing sea temperatures and sea levels can change the migration patterns of whales and seabirds. And so this kind of leads to where local native species haven't previously come into contact with these species that now have changed migration patterns. So it's kind of these new encounters and opportunities for sharing of viruses which might lead to spillovers. And a specific flashpoint for spillover into humans would probably be the handling of like raw and dried meat by hunting communities. So they're particularly at risk of spillover events in this scenario. And of course, there's so many more ways that a new virus could emerge. And there are some examples which I've come across that are probably less likely, maybe a bit more out there than the previous scenarios. But I wanted to include them because the nature of disease X is that it could really come from anywhere. And so some of the examples of places it can come from would be extreme and unexplored ecosystems, like deep sea vents or unexplored cave systems. It could also come from some more unlikely spillover events. So, for example, from insects. So insects can be vectors for diseases in humans, but we aren't typically able to be infected by insect viruses. So that's another potential spillover. It's unlikely, but anything is possible in nature. We could also have something coming as a byproduct from synthetic biology, so where recombinant viral vectors they're usually harmless and they're not able to replicate, but they could encounter wild viruses in wastewater and then recombine to give rise to new replication competent viruses. We also have things like the import of exotic animals as pets. So again, this is the same scenario where a species that is usually so isolated from another is now having this new encounter, and that's a possibility for the exchange of kind of viral material. And finally, and maybe one of the most mysterious sources of them all, I would say, is space. Because no one truly knows what's out there, and there are programs like the Mars Sample Return program where they're looking to see if they can find any biological material on Mars. So they're planning on returning samples, and there's a chance that unknown biological matter could interact with existing Earth pathogens. And so that's why there's currently work being done to build high containment labs to process these samples. So yeah, just as a quick summary, we're seeing that outbreaks of disease and pandemics are becoming more common, more frequent, and we've got threats from existing viruses, but there's also always a threat from disease X or the next disease to emerge. And there are loads of different scenarios where that could come from, and some of the main ones I went over was obviously wildlife, agriculture, and then we also have a chance of it coming from human activity, either accidentally or engineered. And I also just wanted to highlight, if you scan the QR code, we have a mailing list for CBH if you want to hear more about biosecurity. And yeah, I'd love to answer any questions if you've got any.